Well, welcome everybody. We're here today to congratulate the winners of the London Book Fair Excellence Awards. This particular award is for the Educational Learning Resources Award. And my fellow judges for this award, Jane and Kai and myself, we were all delighted by the quality of entries this year. And we were particularly impressed with the entry that we chose to be our winner, which is Karadi Path Education from India. And I'm delighted today to welcome the founder of Karadi Path, CP Vishwanath. Welcome, Vish.
Thank you very much and namaste. We are delighted to be recipients of the International Excellence Awards of London Book Fair. So thank you very much for considering us worthy of the honor.
Great. Well, it's good to be talking to you today. I have a few questions which I thought we could run through to give people who are watching this interview, give them an idea of who you are and what you do. So I think it would be helpful if you could start by telling us a bit about Karadi Path, how and why you started the enterprise.
Well, I could point to probably three, events, so to speak, which would tell us how we got to this point. The first event is, my son was growing up in the US when we were living there, and he grew up on Disney audiobooks, which is a book as well as an audio cassette, which he would read along. And we found that, that is something that really helped him with his reading, with his language, and all of that stuff. When we came back to India, my wife, who's an educator, my wife Shobha, who's an educator and a writer, we said, let's create beautiful books for children based on the Indian ethos, on the using the Indian aesthetic, both from a content point and artistic standpoint and musical standpoint. So we started, Karadi Tales was the company that started creating audiobooks, where we had, really good narrators, great music, and illustrated books. These started getting used, they were meant for individual buyers. But at some point of time, schools started seeing that there was a lot of benefit to using these as language enrichment tools in the classroom. And so they would ask us to purchase 40 books and one audio CD or audio cassette, depending on the time frame in which this was. And they started using it for language enrichment. And at one point, we came up against this experience where somebody wrote to us and said, we are using it in the slums of Dharavi to teach the slum children, to introduce English to them, and wonderful things are happening, you must come see. We went to see them and we realized that the children were enjoying the stories, they were relating to it, they were able to answer questions in their mother tongue or the local language about what happened in the story. The teachers interpreted this as if they were learning English. But when we looked at it, we realized that they were not really relating to the language content as much as the visual and the audio and the music and the narrative, the expressions, the non-verbal part of the expression that the audiobook represented. They were actually relating to that and understanding a lot of what the content was. But the important point of this is that it was an epiphanic moment when you realize that each of these children spoke a minimum of 3 languages. These were 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds because they had come from different parts of India. They had come to this huge space, this huge slum in Mumbai. I think if you have seen Slumdog Millionaire, you will know, what Dharavi, the location is. And they live in the environment of multiple languages and they pick it up, almost effortlessly. And then you realize that in India, all of us are effortlessly multilingual, not because we went to school and learned the language, but simply because we had the opportunity. And then we also realized that, whenever a language is taught only inside a classroom and there's no environment of the language, you almost never learn the language, if you don't have the ecosystem. So this kind of got us into thinking that there is something fundamentally wrong about the classroom process versus the natural acquisition process. And we started studying this Indian multilingualism process, much, much more closely. And we realized that this movement from non-verbal to verbal is a journey that needs to be replicated in some form or the other if you want to learn a new language. The importance of listening to a lot of language, whether you understand it or whether you don't understand it, the primacy of that was something that struck us. And so then we kind of got onto a fairly long journey of understanding, how is it that we learned our second and third languages, and how can we actually make that a part of the classroom? So that was the genesis of Karadi Path itself.
So from that start, you've ended up with a program which is won the award today. Can you just tell us how do the elements of that program work? Because I know you've got 4 pathways in that. Can you just briefly tell us what the 4 pathways are?
So in effect, it is a question of replicating some of those nonverbal cues. So you learn language using the body. So you have a module called Action Path, where you just do a whole series of different commands, and you would use lots of syntactical structures, in the process. So you gather both vocabulary as well as syntax. The children would just do those commands, so it would be, open the book, close the book, place the book on your neighbor's head. So all different elements of, the language are introduced in the process of them listening, seeing, and doing the command. And then you have the musical aspect, because we register a foreign language much better when it is embedded on top of a musical structure. And so, there were simple rhymes and then activities from where you discovered those, what was the meaning of that rhyme. And then you had story, the element of story, which was again these using the audiobooks. Reading was probably the only path where there was some element of instruction. Otherwise, everything else was simply pure immersion. No teaching of words, no teaching of meanings, no teaching of grammar. You are supposed to predict the communication, and then through the non-verbal process, discover it, and then make it your own as the verbal communication also seeps into you. And this is how, our brains are wired to learn language.
Sure. That's really interesting. And obviously at the moment, there is quite rightly, I think everywhere, a great emphasis on impact and effectiveness.
Yeah.
How do you know that your program is effective? How do you measure that?
I think the classic way of measuring it is simply, suppose I have, let's say, studied English in a non-English ecosystem for 5 years. Okay, so there is a certain amount of hours of English that I have been exposed to. So that forms a certain baseline. And from there, you say, okay, now we start with the Karadi Path program. And, you spend about 48 hours with it or 96 hours with it, which is typically the kind of blocks that we have. And we realize that in 96 hours, we are able to kind of raise them by 5 to 6 grade levels, compared to how the conventional classroom worked. And so there are control groups that we use. That is more for an objective measure. The fact is that when you walk into this classroom, or when you talk to the teacher, or when you talk to the children, you'll realize that suddenly English is not a subject for them, but a language. Sure. They're moved from it being a subject to actually a language that I can actually interact with, communicate in. Otherwise, they were just memorizing textbooks, writing questions and answers and grammar questions, etc., which made no sense to them whatsoever. It was torture for them for the most part.
Yeah. Okay, and in your submission, you stress the importance very much of reaching first generation learners, often people in marginalized communities. How do you go about reaching those marginalized learners? How do you do that? But lots of people try to do that and find it very difficult. What's been your successful strategies for doing that?
I think the most important part of the success is simply how the program itself was designed such that even if a teacher did not know English, she could still administer the program, because you're not going to find the teacher's ability in English beyond the ability to administer the textbook, in many of these marginalized areas. Sure. You simply will not have that many teachers. So the kind of, teaching learning material that we created, such that there is a mentor-led process, and the teacher is more of a facilitator than a teacher of the language itself. So you have this fantastic way in where the children learn the language and the teacher is also learning the language along with them. So we often call the teacher in such a classroom as student number 1. So, so student number 1 is just leading the children through the processes, through the modules, but she's a co-learner along with them. And so this was, and English in India is a very, very aspirational, skill. We think Indians speak English a lot because there's a small segment that
sure,
speaks
yeah,
and writes.
absolutely, yeah.
The fact of the matter is, 90% of India is still aspiring for that possibility, and it is also a huge opportunity and a confidence builder. So it's not just a question of having given you this gift of a language, but also the gift of confidence, because somewhere they feel that they belong when they start speaking English, even in a small way. So that is something that the need was great, and we were able to take it successfully to these spaces.
Okay, that's really interesting. And obviously a key part of that is the affordability, the price aspects. So how have you managed to keep this affordable, to really keep the price down to something that these marginalized users can use?
So there are two things, Robert. There is affordability and there is accessibility also. So I'll talk about the affordability part of it. Once you invest a lot in the development and the content and everything. And today, with technology and digitization, really the cost of delivery isn't very significant. So the whole thing is, have I created the content? Have I kind of modularized the content? Have I created everything such that it is completely self-contained to a large extent that even a teacher in a remote area can actually offer it? And then when you have large numbers, once you kind of grow to a certain scale, you will find that the affordability, is really not the big challenge. It becomes a smaller and smaller challenge as you scale. Accessibility during the pandemic, and this is one of the big challenges that we faced, during this period, is in how do I reach these disconnected areas, when at a time when the children are not coming to school. And this is where I think, really beautiful organic collaboration emerged, where the teachers of the school, they took the app on their phones and then went to the communities, village to village, using the Karadi Path modules, which was there in the form of an app. And then they would hook it to a car speaker, or they would hook it to, some local speaker that was out there, and the children would do the actions on the street, in a temple in the neighborhood, or in some kind of a social space. And it would be 10 children at a time, 15 children at a time. But the teachers could carry everything that they needed with them as they went from village to village. And so I think both on the affordability and accessibility area, the last mile learning is something that, we feel really wonderful that we were able to accomplish something like this, in such a disconnect.
I think that's a really interesting point, combining that affordability and accessibility, two sides of the same coin. I think it's very important. Yeah, it's a good point. Finally, Vish, what does the future hold for Karadi Path? How do you see your enterprise evolving now in the next few years?
We have hardly scratched the surface. I think that, what is left to do is very, very large. And the way that the methodology of this approach is also evolving, it is still a learning journey for us. How do I, condense it? How do I create more learner engagement? How do I improve my efficacy? So I think in that sense, as far as the market or the need is concerned, that is very large. It's more a question of how much are we able to do in our, with the resources that we have, how fast are we able to actually make this bigger and wider. And definitely looking at, some time ago when I was in London and I was speaking to a group of educators, I told them that in the near future, we want, people in different countries like Japan, China, will learn English not from the British or the Americans, but from Indians.
From the Indians.
So I look forward to that becoming true.
Okay, thanks very much. That's really interesting. Thanks very much for talking to us today, Vish, and many congratulations again to you and your colleagues on what is a really innovative and I know very successful educational program. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. My pleasure. Namaste.